Just so everyone knows who's watching, and I know there's a few people watching already, that there were some serious storms yesterday in this area, and we have really hot weather in London, Ontario, so that we had some big thunderstorms, and so the internet is not perfect today, and there's nothing I can do about it at this very moment. It is being professionally recorded, and so it will go to our YouTube page when we're done the whole event, and those people can watch it again, or it can be watched by anybody at that time from our YouTube page, and we'll put a link out as soon as that's ready. So I'm just going to introduce the day. This is the 20th anniversary event. You might have noticed that it's the 20th anniversary of myself. I'm 20 years working full-time in the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, so it's a little bit different than a 20th anniversary in general, but I'm accepting the anniversary as it's mine to be shared with everyone. And today we have interesting presentations for you, so hopefully there'll be a lot of people getting information out of this, whether you're watching it now or in the future. I'm be presenting first, and my talk will be on the fatal flaws of euthanasia and assisted suicide. I'll be followed by Amy Hasbrouck, our president. She's also the founder of Toujours, Vivant, not dead yet. And then it'll be Taylor Hyatt, who's a researcher for Toujours, Vivant, not dead yet. And then we're going to have Maxime from Quebec, from the Vivre dans la Dignité, the Living with Dignity group in Quebec, talking about the different issues about all that's going on. And it'll be followed then by Kristina Hodgetts, who will give you a little bit of information about the Compassionate Community Care Program. And finally with Catherine Glenn Foster talking about what's going on in the US and a bit of a message there. So my message is more general, and I will start with my PowerPoint presentation. And so what's going to happen here is that we have this recording going on, and the person controlling this will then shift to the PowerPoint here and there, and you'll be able to see it. So, and in the future, if anybody wants, for instance, my PowerPoint, if you email me at info@epcc.ca, I can send it to you. That won't be a problem, as well as my other PowerPoints I have. So basically, euthanasia and assisted suicide, here's my first message to you, is it's sold to us, to the culture, through what I call, and what we've called in our film, a series of fatal flaws or lies. We're told that euthanasia is about freedom, choice, and autonomy. This is simply not true. This is not what it's about. We're told that these people are dying anyway. So this whole thing is, well, you know, Alex, they're dying anyway. Well, many of these people might have years to live. So this is not true. We're told that these laws have effective safeguards. But if you read the laws aren't designed in that way. In fact, they have language which is undefined and loose. And in the Canadian law, especially, we have several parts of that. I say the language is loose enough to drive a hearse through it. That's the funny little joke. And we're told that the person must make a clear request, but this is not always true. Let me start, first of all, though, by talking about why people ask for euthanasia and assisted suicide. And I think this is a clear key issue to all of this for us. And that is because people go through what we would call normal human realities. So if you're considering euthanasia and assisted suicide, someone's considering this when they're going through the most difficult time of their life. They're going through a time of physical issues, maybe psychological issues. They are often going through depression or loneliness, fear of future pain. What's most important here, though, as a human being, there's nothing new about somebody feeling that their life has lost value, their life has lost purpose. There's nothing new about someone going through a very difficult time in their life, going through existential questioning, if that being what it is, or feeling like there's just simply no purpose to their life. You know, this is not a new experience as someone might think. I have fear for the future. I don't know how to get through this. I'm not sure. And why am I alive? I might want to, you know, rather be dead. This is not a new feeling. This is a human reality when someone is going through an emotional distress. The difference when we legalize euthanasia and assisted suicide is the other side says, oh, it's about your choice and autonomy. Really what it's about is it's abandoning people at the lowest time of their life. What it is it's saying, in the past when someone would say, you know, they felt that their life had lost purpose and value, or they wanted to die, the physician would then be thinking about, how do we provide the help this person needs? How do we provide the services they need in order to get over this hump that they're feeling? But now today, it becomes a request for death. So the difference between before and now is now when you're going through what I call a normal human reaction to these difficult times in life, what we have instead now is this becomes the request for euthanasia. And the whole point of it is that in every jurisdiction that's legalized euthanasia, it's done by the doctors gaining the right in law to cause your death. So if we're talking about assisted suicide, that's when the doctor would then prescribe the lethal drugs to you and you would technically take it yourself. The physician is then agreeing that your life is not worth living. They're agreeing that your request for assisted death, lethal drugs, is reasonable in their sense, and that they wouldn't want to live like you either, and then they make the prescription. In the case of euthanasia, when it's lethal injection, you have a situation then where it's the doctor who's then agreeing your life is not worth living, and they go ahead and actually kill you. It's the actual act then of killing you. And those are the differences between assisted suicide and euthanasia. So what's sold to us as choice and freedom and autonomy is actually an abandonment of people at the lowest time of their life. This is what it's about, this is what it leads to, and this is where it goes. So, is euthanasia about freedom and autonomy? Well, you know, the recent Fatal Flaws film that EPC produced with Dun Media that has done very well, it's been shown all over the place, and if you haven't seen it yet, you need to see it, you need to purchase it. One of the main stories in the film is about Marguerite's mother who died by euthanasia without request. Now, if we had more time today and everything, I would actually, you see I have the link there for the YouTube video of it. But what happened is that Marguerite's mother was brought to the hospital. She gets a phone call saying, come to the hospital. Her mother's been brought to the hospital. The doctor decides that she had pneumonia. She was not dying. She was not nearing death. It's not like she was a person who had late-stage cancer and it's a matter of days and, oh, the doctor made a decision just to hurry it up, per se, as they might say. No, in this case, she had pneumonia. And the doctor decided that, well, because, you know, Marguerite's mother didn't want to go to the hospital and she was, you know, not wanting to go out and she was, you know, in these situations, that maybe the best thing was to inject her. No one had requested it. Her mother had not requested it. The family had not requested it. So what happened is as she was going to the hospital, she gets a phone call because she's the power of attorney. She's the person to make decisions for her mother. She gets the phone call from the physician in the hospital saying, oh, you don't have to hurry because we've given her something. And she's not going to wake up from this. And you would say, well, how could this happen? How could this happen? Well, I thought it was all about freedom of choice and autonomy. I thought that's what it was about. Is this really what it's about? Remember, the doctor then says to her, when she says, well, how could you do this? Who would make such a decision? How would and she had her daughter with her and she's asking the doctor this. The doctor says, well, you weren't here to decide. So we had to make a decision. So I made the decision. And this was his response. What about Candace Lewis? Now this is a Canadian case, and many of you have heard about Candace Lewis because she was in the media. We've certainly talked about Candace Lewis. She was featured in Fatal Flaws. Candace is at the time 25, so this is shortly after euthanasia became legal in Canada. This was in August of 2016. She was born with multiple disabilities. She's in the hospital. She's having serious health difficulties, and the doctor is pressuring the family and Candace to ask for euthanasia. The doctor's saying, did you know that assisted death has been legal? Assisted suicide death is legal. And Candace's mom is saying, I didn't know that. And he's saying, well, I'm supportive of this. And she's like, well, you know, that's your point of view. That's your business. We don't want anything to do with this. And he's pressuring her. It's all about pressuring her to, quote, quote, choose an assisted death. Really what it was about is, here you have a physician who sees a woman with multiple disabilities who's clearly going through a difficult health situation. No one's questioning that she wasn't going through a very difficult situation. There's no question about that. He's viewing her life as not worth living. He's viewing her life as, this is a good case for euthanasia, and I guess they haven't heard about it yet, so I'm going to share this new information so they can ask for this. Well, this is what it's about. And I want you to know, we've gotten several calls like this from other people who may not want their stories being told in a wider sense, where they're being pressured. But not only people like Candace, which is bad that they were pressuring Candace, her family, in this whole situation for euthanasia, but what about the doctors who are now being pressured by others now to do it? This is also the other effect that's going on. The pressuring. Is it about choice? Is it about terminal illness? They say it's about terminal illness. Well, if it's about terminal illness, then Jeanette Hall would have been dead 20 years ago. Jeanette Hall, now the slide says 18 years ago. It's actually 19 years ago now. Jeanette Hall is in Oregon. She went to Dr. Stevens. She had cancer. She wanted the pills, okay? She wanted assisted suicide. This is what she wanted. She had a treatable condition, but her aunt had died with cancer. It was her aunt had lost her hair. Her aunt went through some difficult symptoms. Her reaction was, I want the pills. Jeanette had voted in favor of assisted suicide. It was legalized in Oregon through a plebiscite, through a voter initiative, right? And she wanted assisted suicide. But Dr. Stevens, he didn't believe in assisted suicide, but he also did what a good physician would do. He spoke to her. He found out about Jeanette Hall. What was important about Jeanette Hall was she had a son. This was very important to Jeanette. She had a son, and her son was at the time in the school to become a police officer, right? So he's an officer. He's becoming a police officer. So he says, so Dr. Stevens, and finding out how important her son is to her, and finding out what her condition was, and she was saying she didn't want treatment, she wanted the pills, and he said, you know, if you accept treatment, I guarantee you'll be at your son's graduation. And it made her think. It made her think that I have something worth living for. She felt she had nothing to live for. She felt she had lost hope. She was afraid. These are all normal human realities. Dr. Stevens wasn't saying to her, I guarantee you, Jeanette, you will live for 19 years. He was saying to her, well, if you accept treatment and not assisted suicide, you can then see your son graduate. And it made her think. So if you're watching Fatal Flaws, you'll see then Dr. Stevens saying in the film, well, then I was in dinner 5 years later after Jeanette she actually was cured. She got better. This is a good thing. That doesn't mean everyone will be cured and everyone will get better, but it does mean. So 5 years later, he's having dinner with his wife at a restaurant, and who's there? Jeanette Hall. And Jeanette came up and said, you know, Dr. Stevens, if I had had a different doctor, I would be dead now. And that's the whole key to this. The law is designed to give the power to the physician. So we're talking about my body, my choice. It's the only thing I do in the law, whether it be Canada, Oregon, assisted suicide in other states, or in the Netherlands with euthanasia, the only thing I do is I ask for it. And they say, well, asking for it. There's many reasons I might feel my life has lost its purpose and value and feel that the best thing for me is death. There's many reasons I might be very down. That's a normal reality. Okay? The difference is the physician then assesses me. The physician decides. The power's in the hands of the physician to decide whether or not my life is worth living. And that's how the law actually works. Is it about terminal illness? There's lots of cases actually, because you can consider Canada. Many people watch this in the future, obviously, because EPC being here, would be thinking of the Canadian situation. And I mentioned about how the law was wide enough to drive a hearse through it. The Canadian law says that you have to be terminally ill, but then it defines that as, my natural death must be reasonably foreseeable. I don't know, what does that mean? What does it mean that your natural death must be reasonably foreseeable? We had a case of someone who contacted us a couple years ago, and this man had asked for euthanasia, and his wife was opposed. So this is how we got the call from his wife. And he had MS. He was 51 years old. He was fairly debilitated by his MS. That's true. He needed a lot of care. So he needed a high level of care. But he wasn't dying. The doctor who had approved the euthanasia and ended up killing him by the lethal injection, the doctor said the reason she approved him for euthanasia was that she said, well, because he had MS and he was in a bed all the time, he could easily develop a bed sore at any time, which means his natural death was reasonably foreseeable. Well, you see, that's so wide. You know, the interpretation is so wide of this. that in fact the law, well, I have to watch my language. These laws have effective safeguards, it says. So what's effective safeguards? Well, in all jurisdictions, these laws are designed to give the doctor who's willing to kill his or her patients the power and oversight of the law. The system of oversight is a self-reporting system. And they did that on purpose to protect the physician completely. The law, whether it be Canada, Oregon, or the Netherlands, is all a self-reporting system. So the system is designed to cover up any potential of abuse, to ensure that the physician has no fear of reprisal. So for instance, whether it be Canada, the Netherlands, or Oregon, how it works is a physician, or in Canada, nurse practitioners can also do this. They would then meet with the patient, assess the patient, decide whether that patient fits the criteria. But you see, it's very open to interpretation. But what makes it even worse is there's no third-party intervention. This means someone who's totally outside of it, who only does assessments, who is responsible only to the government. There's nothing like that. How it works is a second physician that approves what the first physician has said. Most jurisdictions, the second physician never has to even meet the patient. They're only doing an assessment as to whether the first physician seems reasonable in what they've decided. And as I said, in Canada, it's also nurse practitioners. And then after the person has died, it's the physician who approved the death, who causes the death, who sends in the report. And then they say, oh, well, this is oversight. We have a report gathering system. Well, later on with the presentations from Amy and Taylor, you'll find out a little bit about these reports, especially the Quebec report. Gives us a little bit more information about how the oversight is actually working. The fact of it is that the system is designed to protect the physician. It's not designed to protect someone who has lost hope and is seeking death for whatever reason. These laws also apply to people with psychiatric conditions. Now that's Canada, it applies to psychiatric conditions. And in places like Oregon, and it also does because in fact very few assessments are done. The law requires an assessment in the state of Oregon for assisted suicide, and very few assessments are ever done. In California even, they've gone even further and said that you can't deny assisted suicide to someone in a psychiatric institution. When in Canada it says physical or psychological suffering. Now it also says that your natural death must be reasonably foreseeable. But I'm assuming that someone who has attempted suicide on multiple occasions would then qualify for euthanasia in Canada, or could be interpreted that way based on the fact that their natural death is reasonably foreseeable. Do people die by euthanasia without request? Well, you see, we don't have a lot of Canadian data, but we do have data out of Belgium and the Netherlands. And the most recent data out of Belgium shows us, and there was a study that came out showing us that in 2015, sorry, that's the Netherlands study. In 2015 in the Netherlands, there was 431 euthanasia deaths without request. And that's so the Netherlands does what you call these meta studies, where they're looking at a huge number of deaths, and they interview then the physicians, and then they're gaining data on this huge number of deaths, and then they can extrapolate from that data how many deaths are occurring without request. And these are done as blind studies, so therefore what's happening is the physician who's being questioned knows that what he's saying in the questionnaire is not going to get him or her in trouble with the law if there's something that's quite serious. Okay? And in the Netherlands and Belgium, the 2013 study, which is the most recent one we had, showed that there was 1,000 euthanasia deaths without request. This is huge. Now, does this happen in Canada? I have no idea if this is happening in Canada to whatever degree, because we haven't done any serious study. But the fact of it is we're talking about human nature again. And so if someone's life is seen as not worth living by a physician, if somebody is, let's say someone's incompetent, and the family is pressuring the physician, could this possibly be happening at times? Well, it'd be nice to know, but I'm assuming that if it happens that often in the Netherlands and Belgium, it must be happening here. The laws are also based on personal suffering. Well, my friends, there's lots of interpretation around personal suffering. And it's not that I don't have feelings for people experiencing personal suffering. I just recognize the reality that this is totally open to interpretation. The Fatal Flaws film features serious stories. Now, what I'm doing is I'm talking about this because, many people are going to say, how do I spread the message on euthanasia and assisted suicide? How do I talk to people about it? How do we make this possible? Well, you You can order a couple of the pamphlets and things from the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. You can bring in a speaker. But you know, the easiest way to do it is simply to purchase the Fatal Flaws film or the previous one, the Euthanasia Deception, and show it in your community. And sometimes 50 or 100 people come out, and sometimes 10 or 20 people come out. But the point of it is it's the easiest way to organize an event to bring people out and actually talk about the issue, because you're actually then showing these stories in an effective manner. And that's what we've been promoting. You know, an elderly woman with pneumonia died by euthanasia without request in the Netherlands. These are real stories. There was another story that's not in the film, which is very powerful, of, and actually it was mentioned in the film, of the woman in the Netherlands who had dementia. She had dementia and she had previously requested euthanasia, but now she's incompetent. So when the family and the doctor decided to go ahead with the death, the woman is saying no. She's saying no. And now this case is right now in the courts, because what ended up happening is the woman resisted, saying no, no, no. She didn't want it. Okay, she didn't want to die. Now, she had previously requested it, but there's many reasons you might fear for your future and put into some document, yeah, if I had this condition, I would rather be dead. That doesn't mean when you're in that condition, you would actually rather be dead. It just meant that when you were asked, you know, 10 years earlier or 5 years earlier, that's how you felt about the situation. So what happened is the physician put the sedative in her coffee and thought, well, if we sedate her first, then it's going to be easy to kill her. Then what happened is that when he goes to inject her, she's still resisting. So I guess there wasn't enough sedative in the coffee. Nonetheless, she then asks, that it was a female physician in this case, she then asks the family to hold her down as the injection's done. Well, let me tell you, is this all about choice and autonomy? There's the link. You can find out more about the fatal flaws. And we can put that up again later. It's a very important thing. This has been, so just so you know, we've sold thousands of this film already. You can actually download it. You can buy it from the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. The idea is to show it. You know, the main media, just so you know, when we produced the Fatal Flaws film with Dun Media, we tried very hard to get some of the major media outlets to decide to show it or show a piece of it or to come to an agreement with them on something like this, and none of them bit. Like, there was serious work done into this. You're saying, you know, what are we doing to try and get the message out to the main, part of the culture? They turned us down. If you consider in Canada, CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, has shown several major films promoting euthanasia in like an outright way promoting euthanasia, yet they wouldn't even take a piece of the fatal flaws. I don't know. Like, to me, that's not exactly what you call even production value or even promotion. So the way we have to do it is we have to get the message out ourselves. Here's our contact information, and for those who are going to be watching it later, you can email me also anytime, as you see, at info@epcc.ca. And I don't know if I have any questions that have come to me by email. I did send it out. You could send, oh, someone did send me a thing. Oh, that's fine. No question there. So what we're going to do is thank you very much. And I'm going to then switch over to Amy, and Amy's going to introduce her topic to you. And I notice we have a few things here we can make it easier for you guys.
Okay. Great, thank you. I am going to sit down. Okay. My name is Amy Hasbrouck. I am the founder and director of Toujours, Vivant, Not Dead Yet. TVNDY is a bilingual, non-religious organization based in Quebec, but it's pan-Canadian. We are a group of people with disabilities and our allies who promote, who offer an opening for people with disabilities to participate in the discussion around assisted suicide, euthanasia, and other ending of life practices that have a discriminatory impact on people with disabilities. Because our experience as disability rights activists in the 35 years that disabled activists have been working on this issue is that this is an issue of discrimination against people with disabilities, and that we are subject to devaluation by our society, and That is some of the basis of the movement for assisted suicide and euthanasia. Now, some people might be thinking that why does EPC continue if euthanasia has been legalized in Canada? Well, there's there's a lot of reasons. First of all, the practice of euthanasia and assisted suicide needs to be monitored and overseen. The proposals that have been put out and the monitoring system that has been implemented for euthanasia and assisted suicide we've studied them. We do a weekly webcast where we talk about issues related to assisted suicide and euthanasia. We've done some analyses of the proposed monitoring program that has been in effect since last November. And what we've discovered is that the monitoring program is ineffective in detecting abuses, detecting ineligible people who are euthanized, and detecting violations of the safeguards. The monitoring system will not detect when people who are incompetent or incapable of giving informed consent are euthanized. It will not detect when people who are subject to external pressure are coerced or abused into requesting assisted suicide. And as I said, it will not detect situations where people who are ineligible because they don't meet all the eligibility criteria are euthanized or given assisted suicide. And I should say that in Canada, the vast majority of people are being euthanized. Very few, I think less than 10 people so far have requested assisted suicide, which is where they take the action themselves to cause their own death, whereas in euthanasia, it's the doctor who takes the action. And it's a little odd because people are talking about this is my choice, my autonomy, my life, my death, but they're giving over the power to their doctors. And all but a handful have given over that power, yet they're claiming this isn't a question of autonomy. So we have determined that there is still a lot of work for the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition and for Toujours, Vivant, not dead yet. And so we have decided to collaborate on our next project. Now, in the medical assistance in dying law, there is a provision for the law to be evaluated after 5 years of being in place. And that process will start in June of 2020. By that time, more than 10,000 people will have been euthanized under Canada's medical assistance in dying law. That's a lot of people. And by that time as well, there will only have been one report from the monitoring system. Other than that, there will only be interim reports. And what we've seen from these interim reports, if you follow EPC's blog, if you follow our webcasts, you'll know that the interim reports have not given accurate statistics or complete statistics on the numbers of people who've been euthanized. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that there is no verification of euthanasias that are performed by doctors, because it's the doctors themselves that report what euthanasias they've performed. If the doctor chooses not to file the report, there is no way for that to be followed up. In Quebec, where euthanasia has been implemented since December of 2015, there is a secondary follow-up procedure. And that has revealed that doctors are not filing their reports on time, and that there are many doctors' reports that have never been filed. And in fact, even with the verification procedure that exists in Quebec, they have, in the first 3 years, found 20 cases of euthanasia that were not caught by either of the two verification practices for determining that someone was euthanized. So they found some euthanasias that happened that were not reported either by the doctors or by the institutions. So we know that there are euthanasia happening that have not been reported. We also know that there are euthanasia of people who are not eligible. And further, we know that there are many cases that have not even been evaluated by the ending of by Quebec's Commission on End-of-Life Care. So they had a backlog as of a year ago of more than 100 cases that they had not evaluated. And that is, then you have to add the estimated 1,500 euthanasia that took place between April 1st of 2018 and March 31st of 2019. So we know already, before even the first official monitoring report from Canada's Ministry of Health, that there are that we don't have adequate statistics, that euthanasias that are happening are not being reported, and that ineligible people are being euthanized. So part of what we plan to do in response to this 5-year review that is going to begin next June is to try to gather information that is not going to be gathered by the official statistics. So the official statistics are only going to gather the postal code of the person, and some other very basic information, not even race or other demographic information. It's only going to get a very limited perspective on what the person's reasons are, and that is just a checklist. It's not self-reported, it's reported by the doctor, not the individual. So there's not going to be enough information to have an idea of why people are asking for euthanasia, what their needs are, whether their needs are being addressed, whether they are receiving palliative care, whether they are receiving the supports they need to live in the community. So all of those things are missing. That one report will have come out by June of 2020, and yet Parliament is expected to make its decision and evaluate the program based on that one report. So our process is to provide further information on that. And one of the things that we did is we came up with a questionnaire and circulated it to activists who are concerned about this issue. And we asked several questions of the activists about the program, and we have a brief summary of what people said. So one of the first question was what were people's greatest concerns about the first few years of implementation of the medical assistance in dying program. And the first was people that there is a need to offer alternatives to assisted suicide and euthanasia. That the promoters of MAiD are saying this is a question of choice, but people don't necessarily have the choices they need. Most people don't have access to palliative care. Many people, because of the public policy that directs people toward institutions rather than care in their own homes, are forced to live in nursing homes, whereas they would prefer to live in their own homes. So people need alternatives to assisted suicide and euthanasia, effective palliative care and home care. Also, assisted suicide and euthanasia are being normalized. It's being promoted by government, healthcare professionals, and the media as the go-to solution and the only good way to die at this point. And those are problems that need to be addressed both in public education and with the government. There needs to be action taken. We've already written to the CRTC and the Ombudsman, but have had no response from them in terms of the unbalanced coverage of this issue in the Canadian media. So we need to continue with that process. Also, doctors are being pressured to provide medical assistance in dying, and hospices have yielded to the pressure to provide assisted suicide and euthanasia. And opposing assisted suicide has become a fringe position. People are reluctant to speak out against it, and the mainstream opinion is that MAiD is a good thing and it's the best alternative. Another concern people talked about was the lack of accurate reporting and monitoring. People talked about the pressure to relax restrictions such as the 10-day waiting period. People also talked about the liberal interpretation of the reasonably foreseeable death criterion. There was a decision that came from an Ontario court in 2017 that said that it wasn't necessary for the doctor to stipulate a particular amount of time, but in that case, the person wasn't expected to die for another 10 years. So the reasonably foreseeable is a very wide open concept because of that decision. Suffering being subjective, it is defined very broadly. There is intense pressure to expand eligibility. There has been erosion of trust between patients and doctors have felt intense pressure not only to provide medical assistance in dying, but also to refer people for that. And people do not have a safe place where they know that they will not be pressured to accept medical assistance in dying. Some of the, we got a variety of responses to our questionnaire, and if anybody is interested in those responses, I'd be happy to send that information out. I don't think it's necessarily productive to go through the whole thing here. But one of the projects that we have in mind, and we have begun, is to collect data about what is happening to people. And this is a fairly broad perspective on what's happening to people. Both people who've requested medical assistance in dying and people who have been pressured to request it, or people who have been pressured to accept do not resuscitate orders, to refuse medical care, food and hydration, or artificial food and hydration, meaning intravenous nutrition and hydration. And this is one thing that Alex had mentioned in a meeting earlier today, that this idea that people are being pressured to refuse food and fluids is an issue that is tracked in Quebec, but it's not tracked by the federal monitoring system. And this is something that we need to start tracking. So we have developed a very preliminary, because we are not professionals at statistical analysis or data gathering. We've created a preliminary information form, and we've started to record data about some of the people who've had some of these experiences. Either they have sought medical assistance in dying because of reasons that are unrelated to death, because they needed home-based supports and couldn't get them, because they needed palliative care and couldn't get it, or because or they were just being pressured to accept do not resuscitate orders. And we're starting to collect this information, and we need more people to come forward with their stories. And we also need more medical professionals to come forward with their stories about being pressured to perform medical assistance in dying, or even to do referrals for medical assistance in dying. And what we are hoping to do is to record the kinds of information that will not be tracked by the federal government's monitoring program, to demonstrate our concerns to Parliament when this review happens, to be able to document and not just have a few anecdotes, but have a more systematic database of information about the problems that we presented. So I am going to ask my assistant, policy analyst, and outreach coordinator, who is on her way, to come and speak with you about some of the work she's been doing, looking at the concerns people have had regarding medical assistance in dying, the data she's gathered so far. So thank you very much.
Do you want to move that chair or use that chair? So you can just sit on here. Right. That one's going to roll if we don't hold it. Yeah. There you go, Tim.
Okay.
Move this up temporarily.
Yep.
She's ready, right? She can start?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, so hi everyone, hope you enjoyed that little obstacle course there. My name's Taylor Hyatt. As Amy said, I'm the policy analyst and outreach coordinator at Toujours, Vivant, Not Dead Yet. I'm going to go over the results of our survey on what has been happening with assisted suicide, euthanasia, and other life-ending practices in Canada so far. Our database currently has 13 entries in it, so this is just the very beginning, the tip of the iceberg with the most obvious issues. So let's begin with a breakdown of the demographics. Who seeks out assisted suicide and why? Most of our information comes from news stories, so they reflect the population whose desire to end their lives is most likely to get media attention. As my American colleague Stephen Drake has said, they tend to fall into 4 categories, all starting with W. They tend to be white in ethnicity, as all of the people in our current database are. They tend to be well off, although 2 people in our survey identified as having job security issues or lower income. They're usually well. In other words, they don't have an illness or disability, or they've acquired a disability later in life and haven't yet integrated it into their self-image and how they perceive themselves. Finally, they're worried about what the future holds. So in order to be eligible for assisted suicide or euthanasia at all, the person needs to have some kind of illness or disability. And disability and the barriers and discrimination that come with it are poorly understood, dreaded, and even despised by many. 12 of the 13 people in our survey had disabilities and 1 had a chronic condition. 11 needed some kind of accessibility accommodation, and the situation of the remaining 2 wasn't clear. 10 were wheelchair users and needed suitable housing. 5 needed accessible medical equipment. 2 people needed communication assistance to help them express themselves. Another 1 needed help to understand information that was given to them. 8 needed in-home personal assistance. We'll come back to this later. 2 needed breathing assistance. 1 had feeding supports. 1 needed accessible transportation. 1 needed information to be given in plain and simple language, and 1 needed better pain management. As Amy said earlier, the monitoring regulations fall far short of what they ought to be Doctors don't have to ask about circumstances like these when examining a person's request, except to note whether the person required disability support services, for how long they've been received, or if they were not received, are they available and did the medical practitioner know about them? Another factor to keep in mind is that some of the people in our survey acquired their disabilities as adults. Of course, when this happens, it's a lot to deal with. A period of grief and adjustment is natural and normal, and reactions of family, friends, and medical professionals also strongly influence how a person adjusts. And when these people view disability in a negative light, their judgments get in the way of the adjustment process. This is especially true for the folks who needed feeding and breathing supports. Many non-disabled people believe them to be limiting, unpleasant, and incompatible with a good quality of life. Another point that should stand out is the age range, which ran from 20 to the late 60s. Why so wide? Besides traditional non-assisted suicides and people who ended their lives using the government program, our search also revealed mistreatment of people with disabilities and people who contemplated ending their lives due to a lack of supports. In particular, those who acquired conditions later in life may not have known about accommodations or been able to access them. Everyone in our survey also belonged to some kind of disadvantaged group. Besides having disabilities, there were 4 women, 1 person of a lower income, and 1 with job insecurity. Women are more likely to be euthanized due to gender-related issues like poor pain management, limited access to health care, higher poverty rates, and sexist expectations that they put their needs last. As I mentioned earlier, all of the people in our survey were white, so racism wasn't a factor, but we have reason to be concerned that it has played a role in other deaths. We know that people of color regularly receive poorer and less medical care relative to the white population, and they're underrepresented among medical professionals. More specific to Canada, our country has a history of bias against Indigenous groups, and the lack of resources available to them even today has resulted in a 5 to 10 year gap in life expectancy between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous population. As far as pain management goes, Indigenous children are known to have higher rates of chronic or disease-related or dental pain, and they're more likely than non-Aboriginal kids not to be treated for the pain that they have. On a related note, we know that 11 people definitely received healthcare services in their first language, and we're not sure about the remaining 2. Finally, 6 people had no ties to the military, and we're not sure about the veteran status of the last 7. What we do know is that veterans have a suicide risk 1.4 to 1.8 times greater than the general population. And disability, chronic pain, brain injuries, and psychological conditions have all been identified as risk factors. What about applications to the government euthanasia program? 5 people wanted assistance to end their lives, 6 did not, and the other 2 aren't clear. 4 people made 1 application each. 3 people made multiple applications, all of which were denied because they didn't meet the reasonably foreseeable requirement, which is being challenged through the courts in 2 provinces right now. 2 people were offered death by a medical professional, contrary to the criminal code, which says that doctors are not supposed to encourage anyone to seek out assisted suicide or euthanasia. The discussion has to be started by the person who wants to die. And there are another 2 people in our survey who took their lives before the current law came into effect. Among those who wanted assisted suicide and euthanasia, here are some of the reasons behind the requests. 2 people found their inability to engage in enjoyable activities unbearable. 1 cited a loss of dignity, but living with breathing or feeding assistance or any other disability supports does not take away your dignity, does not make you any less human or worthy of life. 3 were isolated or lonely. 1 was concerned about being unable to perform everyday activities, think cooking or running your finances. 2 had inadequate pain management. 2 had other symptoms that went unaddressed. 2 cited lack of control of bodily functions, with their situations violating the false social construct that says retention of bodily fluids is necessary to be considered a whole human being. 2 didn't want to live in an institution like a nursing home, and there's 1 for whom we're not sure. Quick rundown of nursing homes. You might be wondering why they're so awful. People often live in institutions because of lack of resources to live in their own homes. These facilities are unsanitary, in poor repair, understaffed, and have high staff turnover rates. Nursing homes restrict the choices available to their residents. So imagine your meal times, the times you use the bathroom, your bedtimes, all set based on what is best for the staff. Your baths may be limited, and you might even have rations on something as simple as toilet paper. When residents complain, their complaints are dismissed as trivial, and we've found numerous incidents of neglect and abuse by staff and between residents. A variety of medical conditions were represented in our stats. Neurological conditions were the most common diagnoses, think ALS. 3 of the 13 people had those. 1 person had cancer. 1 had a cognitive disability and another had a psychological condition. 2 were listed as having a physical disability, including 1 person whose pressure sores went untreated. 9 people had received some kind of treatment for their condition. 1 had not. 2 people were being denied the care they needed, and again, there's 1 whose status we're not sure of. Life-sustaining measures didn't apply to most people, but 5 had received such care. 2 people had feeding supports, and there were 3 in total who had breathing supports. 5 people owned or rented their home. 4 lived with family. 1 lived in a nursing home, 2 were hospitalized, 1 was homeless. And here's a breakdown of those necessary home-based services that people needed. 1 person needed care from a nurse who visited their home. They did not get it, and another 1 received it. 3 people needed mental health supports that they didn't receive. 3 people required modifications to make their living situation accessible, and 3 more received them. 1 person was in need of homemaking assistance. 1 person received it. 5 people needed personal assistance at home, self-directed home care, and 1 person received it. Of those who needed help with their personal care, 7 received this assistance from unpaid family members. 2 received it from an agency whose staff visited their home, and 4 received assistance from institution staff. And the issue with family members is that they might know you very well and understand your needs, but have expectations and schedules and other responsibilities of their own. On top of that, because they are serving as both assistant and loved one, those roles might clash. They may end up resenting each other, or 1 role might take up more time than the other one. And it's situations like these that contribute to the common view that life with a disability is awful and a burden. What about palliative care and relief of unpleasant symptoms? 3 people needed better pain management, 2 needed relief from other symptoms, and an additional 3 needed support for a psychological condition. 1 person needed counseling to deal with their grief, and 2 would have benefited from peer support, because nobody quite understands life with a disability or medical condition like someone else who shares it. 2 people were offered relief from pain or other symptoms. In 1 case, it was discontinued, which contributed to the distress that the person was experiencing. 2 people received symptom management at home. Another 2 were looked after in a hospital. 4 people just didn't need palliative care, and 2 needed something else, like that in-home assistance. On to the actual applications for euthanasia and assisted suicide. 4 people filed a written application for euthanasia, 8 did not, and the status of the last one is unknown. Everyone in our survey, thank goodness, was over the age of 18 and eligible for government health care. And one of the most basic facts to know is that you don't offer assisted suicide to a completely healthy person. It's always going to be discriminatory because you're only eligible if you have a disability or other health condition. Which 12 of the 13 people in our survey had. The most important criterion under the law as it stands right now is the grievous and irremediable medical condition. So 12 of the 13 people had a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability, and we don't know about the last one. 7 people had conditions that were in a state of irreversible decline. 3 were not. We don't know about the other 3. 4 experienced enduring and intolerable physical or psychological suffering that could not be relieved. 5 did not. We have no information on the other 4. And only 3 people in the survey could be said to have a reasonably foreseeable death. 7 did not, and we don't know about the last 3. Once the applications were submitted, and once these criteria were examined, did the medical professionals dig any deeper? We only know that one person's ability to understand information, evaluate risks, and express their final choice was properly assessed. There were 4 people for whom this information isn't known, and in 6 cases this information wasn't collected. 2 of those 6 took their lives before the law came into effect. And again, only once was potential impairment of the person's decision-making abilities explored. It could be caused by depression, prolonged periods of suicidality and distress, substance abuse, untreated pain, or poor self-esteem. 8 times these factors were not looked into, and we don't know about the other 4. Pressure from circumstances, which is the external pressure that Amy mentioned earlier, was definitely overlooked or ignored in 9 out of 13 cases. For example, isolation, living within the limitations of an institution, abuse, financial issues, or other needs going unmet at home. For 4 people, the stories didn't make this clear. Suicide prevention was not offered to 7 people, and it's unclear whether the other 6 received any intervention. 3 people received the assistance they needed to communicate, 4 did not, and communication supports didn't apply to the remaining 8. Here's some more miscellaneous information about the requests. Only 1 healthcare professional made sure all of the eligibility criteria were met. 3 times we know the practitioner did not check the criteria, and we don't know about the other 3. 2 people were not evaluated because they ended their lives another way. 1 by ending life-sustaining care. 1 was declared ineligible. 2 people lacked other forms of in-home assistance. They didn't want anything to do with life-ending measures at all. Only 1 person made a request for euthanasia that was made in writing, signed by the person and 2 witnesses, and dated. 6 people did not, and information is unavailable or doesn't apply to the remaining 4. 1 person was informed of the seriousness of their condition, the predictability of their death, the availability of palliative care, and the ability to withdraw the euthanasia request. 6 people were not, and we have no information about the other 4. In 1 case, we know the 10-day waiting period was followed. In 3 cases, we know it was not. 3 times the person took matters into their own hands without using the government program, and the other 4, no information is available or it didn't apply. Only once did a second doctor approve the euthanasia request. 3 people took matters into their own hands, took their own lives. 2 people were offered MAiD by a professional, again contrary to the law, and 1 was deemed ineligible. The final outcomes for the people whose stories we collected are as follows. 5 took their lives, including 1 who stopped using life-sustaining care. 2 died by euthanasia. 4 were able to return to their homes from an institution and from a health crisis given adequate supports. 1 died of an undiagnosed condition. It's possible that something urgent was overlooked due to assumptions about the nature of their condition. 1 person received a psychiatric assessment, but any further updates have not been made public. What even this small amount of data tells us is that we don't know whether the law is being followed, including all the safeguards and eligibility requirements. More importantly, the choice to end one's life doesn't look like a choice at all. While the medical field and non-disabled observers have traditionally focused on cures, social services have not kept up by enabling people to establish and maintain control over their everyday lives. Therefore, we live in a society that is currently doing more to guarantee equality in death than in life. And contrary to the government regulations, people are being pressured to end their lives in a time of weakness. Death is serving as a cover and a catch-all to a variety of unaddressed issues. So more than anything, I hope the stats we gather serve as a wake-up call. Thank you.
Presentation. There you go, Maxime. Yeah, we'll slide forward. No, we'll go forward. Yeah. Good. Good. Just get this one here. Fine.
Second. Sorry about that. Yeah, we're good.
We're good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You gotta introduce yourself, Maxime.
Sure. Well, hi everyone. My name is Maxime Huot Couture. I'm the Deputy Director of Living with Dignity, which is a non-religious and without political affiliation citizen network based in Montreal that defends the inherent dignity of the human person independently of their health condition. So let me start with a picture. The recent developments in our medical and moral culture around euthanasia gives me the weird impression of attending a big societal trial. Vulnerability is the accused, and autonomy the accuser. Vulnerability is attorney. Care has good arguments and a big heart, but is quite often seen as eccentric, even maniac. Autonomy is attorney, performance, convinces with its own beauties and charms. The judge, compassion, is hard to recognize under its strange wig and legal uniform. And the jury, the citizens, only hear the accuser's speech, as care is allowed to speak only during lunchtime, where of course everyone is out. And for once, strangely, the legal proceedings go very swiftly without any delays or appeals. Now let's see how this trial looks in the province of Quebec. Here's the facts. And I have a simple overview over the numbers relative to euthanasia in Quebec And let me remind you that euthanasia only as assisted suicide is prohibited in the province. So that's the numbers from the summary report after 3 years of legalized euthanasia, the official report. On the first year, there was nearly 500 euthanasia, and note that is far more than the number of 100 predicted confidently by the government at this time. 854 on the second year, which is a 1% increase in just 1 year. 284 in the first trimester of the third year, for a total of 1,632 euthanasia in two and a third year. That is nearly 2% of all deaths in the province. But strangely, if we add up the numbers from the three previous reports, as those numbers are from the summary report, we have 400 euthanasia more than the total presented in the summary report. Where those go? Where those went? What's the methodology here? And finally, for the fourth year, our Commission on End-of-Life Care estimated the deaths by euthanasia between 1,300 and 1,500, which is a huge increase and which makes Quebec a follower of Belgium and Netherlands now. And here are some missing facts. First of all, you have to know that there was 10 times more medical assistance in dying forms, MAiD forms, than anticipated. So the so-called exceptional act has become a regular health service, and that also means less time for the Commission on End-of-Life Care to investigate palliative care services, which is the most important part of its mission. So we got 11 euthanasia, which were without the mandatory form, which must be filled by the doctor, and a lot more with incomplete informations. We had around 20 non-declared euthanasia that was said before, and they were discovered by the investigation of the Commission in the papers of different health institutions. 84 forms were delivered more than 6 months out of delay, and some up to 1 year. Some doctors now just refuse to answer the Commission's demands, and that without any admonestations. What will it be next? All in all, the missing information is estimated at 16% of total data we have on euthanasia in Quebec. When we speak of death of vulnerable persons, that number is huge and requires serious rectifications. And you need a good pair of glasses to be informed about MAiD in Quebec, since most of these shortcomings could only be found in the footnotes of the report. Okay, we missed some information, some paperwork had not been done, but the safeguards of the law are still there to protect the patients, isn't it? Not exactly, since the Commission reported also 66 cases of abuse, and that is a minimum. In 5 cases, the patient did not suffer from a serious and incurable illness, as the law expects. In 2 cases, the patient was not at the end of his life. 29 physicians who signed the MAiD form were linked to the patient, which the law prohibits, of course. 10 physicians who put the patients into death did not have any discussions with them before. They didn't meet them. 5 MAiD forms were countersigned by someone who was not a healthcare professional, sometimes just interns. And no sanction at all from the Physician Board of Quebec. It is clear now that the criteria and safeguards do not save the practice of euthanasia from serious abuse. The real difference, now we can see, is between a culture of care and a culture of efficiency. Now, what's the political context in Quebec? As you can see, I decided to entitle that section "The Government, the Report, and the Media." Now, I wasn't sure exactly how to order those three so that it could remind the famous movie title, "The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly." Now, matching the government and the good here is probably just out of natural patriotism, okay? So what about the government? So our present government from the Coalition Avenir Québec party, as you may know, is pro-euthanasia and has already committed to open up the debate on the expansion of medical assistance in dying, while at the same time, two of its ministers stated explicitly their will to expand it to incompetent people, giving, for example, those suffering from Alzheimer's disease. And here enters the report. In 2017, a group of experts, led by Nicole Filion and Jocelyn McClure, were appointed by the government to study the possible expansion of MAiD. The report was announced for the spring. We're still waiting for it, but in last June, there were leaks in the media, and we got a hint of some of the recommendations of the report, which includes or will include euthanasia for patients unfit for consent by means of advanced medical directives. In other words, the expert will recommend to cancel the end-of-life and consent criteria, and a third party will be allowed to choose the moment of euthanasia for patient unfit for consent. And who will it be? An exhausted family caregiver? A pro-euthanasia activist nephew? Or the state even? We don't know yet. As for the media, as in Canada in general, there is now a large consensus in Quebec around the goodness of euthanasia. For the memory, Living with Dignity, which I represent, has 5,000 members, which is 10 times more than our main opponent. Guess who receives all the attention? 10 times more. And all that leads to a subversion of mentalities in the society. First, a subversion of dignity. Daily, we can hear or read assertions like, "Our pets can benefit from euthanasia. Why not my disabled spouse? My wife is suffering from Alzheimer's. She's not herself anymore. She can get euthanasia." There is such a big fear of Alzheimer's disease in Quebec. I don't know if it's because, our national motto is "I remember." But more probably, it is because we lack a complete and substantial notion of dignity and of the human person. A person is never out of date. She lives as a dignified human being through her hopes and pains, her history, and through the eyes of memories and feelings of the ones loving her and caring for her. We also see a subversion of suicide prevention. And hear or read things like, if he had access to MAiD, he would not have committed suicide. This is a twisted reasoning. If euthanasia didn't exist in the first place, that person probably would not have committed suicide. Because the message behind MAiD is this: suicide is a good answer to human suffering. An American study shown that legalizing assisted suicide was associated with a 6.3% increase in total suicide. We are not yet at the rational suicide stage in Quebec, but still suicide prevention is considerably hindered by the practice of euthanasia. And a subversion of medical profession. You may know that 98.3% of all practicing physicians in Quebec are still refusing or avoiding euthanasia. 98.3%. And we don't ask why anymore. We present them as stubborn, regressive, or rebels. And now the Physician Board of Quebec is pushing its members to apply the law and even asks them to advocate MAiD under an obligation to inform about it, as it was clearly mentioned in the recent reminder to the members. Finally, there's a subversion of public opinion and media information. You know, there is still much confusion in the public about what exactly is euthanasia and large ignorance on its various consequences and shortcomings. But this misinformed public opinion is being used by pro-euthanasia advocates to push their agenda. And still, the media favors individual dramatic cases instead of all-issue covering reports, which could inform the public on the important details surrounding euthanasia, details which are crucial in those kinds of delicate issues. Now let me finish with just some thoughts on the proper attitudes to adopt in front of all this. It's not an action plan, but just some attitudes that can be quite useful. First of all, we need to be patient. While some like to slide on the slippery slope of euthanasia and assisted suicide, we need to be resilient and patient. Small victories will come along while we lean on intelligence, dialogue, personal encounter, and passion for justice. Hope. Existential distress, depression, is the first reason for people to ask for euthanasia in Canada. The fear of loneliness, loss of control, and shame is as decisive and probably more decisive than the fear of physical suffering. So we have to have hope, but to give hope by continuing to campaign for accessible and good palliative care, and also by fostering solidarity with elders and disabled persons. It is also crucial to pursue the conversation about the end of life in our families, in our milieu, so that people know that vulnerability is not alien to happiness and peace. We probably won't win the trial, but our testimony will remain as a proof that care is not eccentric, but incentric, and that it brings the best out of the human heart. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Kristina Hodgetts. I'm from Compassionate Community Care. Alex wanted me to come and tell you a little bit about what we do, but I'm going to tell you a story instead. A story of a mother and a baby. And there was this baby had been put to bed one night. She was about 6 months old, and her mother went and had a bath. When her mother came out of the bath, she found her baby unable to breathe. She was kind of purple, and she didn't know what to do. She called 911, and an ambulance came. They told her that her baby had suffered near SIDS, and they took her to the hospital. The next day, the mother called us because they were not going to give the baby a trach. And she was breathing okay with a vent, but she was not going to be offered the one life-saving thing that could really make a difference. So she called Compassionate Community Care. Alex and I went and visited them, and we eventually, with about 6 weeks of seeing them, we did get the trach for the baby. This was over a year ago, and the baby is still alive, still doing well, and she saw the doctor recently, and the doctor said, wow, like, this is incredible. So it just goes to show that we are doing these things for them, and they're really making a difference. At Compassionate Community Care, we are trying to help people who are in, who have difficult situations. They're not getting the medical assistance they need. They're getting offered or forced something else. They maybe just don't know, and they're looking to us for education. If there's, if you or someone you know are receiving care that is not what you want, give us a call. We can help. We'll give you advice, give you some education, whatnot. So that is what we do at Compassionate Community Care. Thanks.
Want the chair, Catherine? So our next speaker is Catherine Glenn Foster. She's from Americans United for Life. She was our founding EPC USA director. She's a lawyer and has lots of information, and she's our final presenter of this event. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Alex. So most of today we've been talking about the situation here in Canada. Makes sense, we're here in Canada. I am here to bring a little bit of a different perspective and talk about the situation as it is in the United States. And that's because several of the jurisdictions that have legalized assisted suicide are in the United States. While there is no federal law on the subject, assisted suicide is now legal in the United States in 9 jurisdictions: in California, Colorado, DC, the District of Columbia, Hawaii, Maine, New Jersey, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington. So taking them chronologically, Oregon was 1997 by referendum. There was an injunction that delayed implementation of the act, but it was lifted in 97, and it has been assisted suicide has been legal in Oregon for 20 plus years. The Oregon Health Authority recently admitted to one of our colleagues, the question is, should the disease be allowed to take its course absent further treatment? Is the patient likely to die within 6 months? And they said, I think you could also argue that even if the treatment or medication could actually cure the disease and the patient cannot pay for the treatment, then the disease remains incurable. And so what we've seen over those 20 plus years is not just the legalization of assisted suicide, but it's this representation of the slippery slope, even as it exists in America, even as we see it playing out in real time before our very eyes, where the Oregon Health Authority is saying, maybe throw the specifics of the law out and say, well, maybe it can be a decision about money. Maybe it can be a decision, without medication, where the person is simply choosing not to take a treatment or pursue a treatment option. And then even this June 18th, we saw the Oregon House sending the governor a measure that would amend the state's assisted suicide law again by removing a waiting period for people who have a prognosis of 15 or fewer days to live. And so we see there again how this slippery slope is in play, and in fact how As we've seen through the years, a few years ago they had a proposal to extend the prognosis time to make it longer so that it could be even longer of a prognosis before you were expected to potentially pass away, as if any prognosis is actually a reliable estimate. As we all know, we've all seen people who've outlived their prognosis, and in some cases by years, by decades. So we're seeing this very concerning expansion of already a very dangerous assisted suicide regime. So that's Oregon. Washington was 2009 by referendum, Vermont 2013 by legislation, California 2015 by legislation. There was a lawsuit. It was challenged in court, but the implementation was halted briefly, but it is in effect. Colorado in 2016 by referendum, DC 2017 by legislation. The implementation started on June 6th of 2017, and this was, of note, the first majority-minority jurisdiction to implement assisted suicide. Hawaii was 2019 by statute, and New Jersey, just on April 12th of this year, New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy signed a bill legalizing assisted suicide into law in the Garden State. That's going into effect on August 1, so just a few days from now. On June 6th, there was a New Jersey Assembly member who with 3 co-sponsors, introduced a bill aiming to repeal the Aid in Dying for the Terminally Ill Act before it goes into effect. And then finally, Maine. On June 12th, Maine Governor Janet Mills, she publicly had said that she wasn't sure whether she wanted to sign this bill into law, but she did. She legalized assisted suicide there. The bill had passed in the House there by only 1 vote. The Christian Civic League of Maine, however, on June 26th, filed a petition to repeal that new law through a People's Veto ballot initiative, and they have until September 18th to collect 63,000 signatures to put that initiative on the ballot in Maine. So we're seeing there are some states in the U.S. that have decided to risk assisted suicide, 9 in total, 8 since Oregon, and so many other states are at risk. I live in Maryland, on the Maryland side of D.C., and back in March, and they called it Aid in Dying, an assisted suicide bill. It came up short in the Maryland State Senate by a single vote. So often it's a 1-vote turn here, a 1 vote to either have it move forward or 1 vote that saves it for the time being. Some assisted suicide proponents have claimed Montana as a state where assisted suicide is legal, but the Montana Supreme Court in 2009, they simply allowed for a consent defense to murder charges or homicide charges. So it isn't actually, there's no law on the books there. And then in Morris v. King, there was a judge in New Mexico who legalized assisted suicide in 1 county there, even though there's a state law making it a felony to assist in a suicide. I filed an amicus brief in that case on behalf of about a dozen state lawmakers and the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. We won before the New Mexico Supreme Court and reclaimed all of New Mexico in that way. But living right outside D.C., working in D.C., I was able to be especially involved with the fight in D.C., and it was a fight. As I said, it was the first majority-minority jurisdiction to legalize assisted suicide. And so, we were on the streets. We were talking with D.C. council members, talking with people in their waiting rooms, on sidewalks, everywhere that we could. And while we did lose that fight, it was rammed through by politicians and signed by a mayor whose own administration testified against this ill-conceived piece of legislation. But the people of D.C., and especially, I would say the minority population, they were vigorously opposed as they learned more about it. They really spoke out and used their voices in opposition as they learned the ways that the law could disadvantage them, as they reflected back on the civil rights era and how our nation had at times failed those who needed us most, who needed support the most. And they weren't happy about the D.C. law, and so many of them were living with terminal illness, with economic disadvantage, with disabilities, and they knew that they would be the first to see and to experience the adverse effects of these laws. And so maybe that's why the first year of assisted suicide in D.C., we saw the response that we did. It was telling. There are 11,000 physicians, doctors who are licensed to practice medicine in DC. You have to have a license to practice medicine. There's 11,000 of them. The doctors who wanted to be able to prescribe assisted suicide drugs had to register for that. They had to say, I want to be on that list of a doctor who's willing to do this. So how many of those 11,000 doctors registered? 2. Only 2. And how many of the 693,972 DC residents went through the process to get those drugs? 0. 0 in the entire first year. So when we're talking about the doctors, we're talking about, not even a 2% percentage, less than 2% of the doctors, less than 0.2% of the doctors in DC, less than 0.02% of the doctors in DC decided to register to be able to prescribe these drugs. And the math is even easier when we're talking about the percentage of the population. It's 0%. So what kind of process, though, would one of those 693,000 some people have had to go through to get those drugs? Was it just so cumbersome that they couldn't? Is that the thing? Do we need to make these laws easier? No, it's actually shockingly easy. The laws in the U.S. do not make it hard. Generally, there's a basic application process. You complete a form, you complete a letter, and purportedly it allows a person with 6 or fewer months to live, a prognosis of 6 or fewer months, assuming we trust the prognosis, to obtain a prescription for lethal drugs. Usually there's a written request form. It requires the signature of 2 witnesses. Now, the current legislation generally requires that one of those witnesses not be related to the patient and not be able to receive benefits upon the patient's death or the person's death, but there aren't requirements for the second witness. So you have a person, and it could be their heir and the heir's cousin. It could be an heir and the heir's best friend. It's not a situation where you have 2 disinterested witnesses for whether this person should be able to complete the form. And then once the drug is dispensed, there's no follow-up supervision. There's no requirement that the death be witnessed by neutral, disinterested parties or by anyone at all, really. There are no requirements that the person who is prescribed the drug actually be the one to perform all the steps to ingest it. And so there's ample room for abuse of this system. We'll get deeper into some of those issues shortly, but suffice to say, even overlooking the core moral human rights issues at the core of assisted suicide, the process is scant, and it opens the door to abuse. So we've talked about the places where the law doesn't protect us. Let's turn briefly to the places where it does. So first, almost every nation in the world, still a vast majority of the states in the Union, we're still talking about 9 states, so more than 80% of the states in the Union still protect us. And you know what? An even greater percentage of the states in the United States have enacted laws to prohibit assisted suicide. How does that work? Well, even Oregon and Washington have these bans in place. Their lawmakers just decided to carve out an exception for one particular profession to assist in the suicides of certain people, the people who perhaps have disabilities or living with disabilities, the people who have some kind of prognosis and diagnosis that, assuming it's correct, might indicate that they might pass away in the not too distant future. But while assisted suicide activists have attempted to argue that these bans on assisted suicide in most of the states, that they weren't ever meant to apply to doctors, to medical professionals, when you look at the legislative histories of these bans, in fact, that's exactly what they were meant for in so many cases. So many of them were in fact enacted in the 1990s as a direct response, as a protective measure in the wake of the Dr. Jack Kevorkian scandal. Specifically to protect us all from predatory physicians, predatory facilities, from organizations or individuals that might not be providing the support that we need. And in the years since Oregon legalized assisted suicide, more states have affirmatively enacted laws to ban the practice, have voted to ban assisted suicide, then have passed laws to legalize it. 8 states since Oregon have legalized assisted suicide, but 10 have banned it. And more than 200 assisted suicide bills have failed in more than half the states. And the legislative efforts to protect vulnerable populations from assisted suicide in the United States have almost universally been supported by the courts. The U.S. Supreme Court in particular has consistently found that for over 700 years, the Anglo-American common law tradition has punished or otherwise disapproved of both suicide and assisting suicide. The first two Supreme Court decisions on the subject, Glucksberg and Quill, declared that nothing in the U.S. Constitution provides for a fundamental right to assisted suicide, and both of those decisions continue to protect Americans today. Moreover, the court has repeatedly held that the preservation and protection of life is a legitimate and valuable state interest, and that while all lives have intrinsic value, society's most vulnerable members, elder adults, those with disabilities, are particularly in need of protection. So these two cases together declare that the government's interest in preserving life outweighs the patient's purported interest in choosing to die, and so states are able to exercise their compelling state interest in protecting vulnerable human life through their civil and criminal laws, and for hundreds of years this was expected and universal. As the Supreme Court said in 1997, even as the states move to protect and promote patients' dignity at the end of life, they remain opposed to doctor-prescribed suicide. The Supreme Court's concerns, lawmakers' concerns, citizens' concerns have proven valid. Suicide by physician, assisted suicide, it puts all of us at risk. It can be applied to people who aren't in fact terminal. It fails to require consent. It subjects people to coercion. We can go on and on and on. And yet the bills that we've seen, the bills we've seen proposed, they have no psychological screening requirement, only a circular requirement that the attending physician refer the patient for counseling if he or she, the doctor, believes the individual needs it. Counseling referrals are not as common as they should be. And in fact, in 2014, only 3 patients of the 155 who requested assisted suicide in Oregon were referred for a psychological evaluation. In 2013, only 2 of these 71 individuals who did end up with choosing assisted suicide and dying by assisted suicide in that state, only 2 of them were referred for counseling. And in one especially clear-cut case, there was a man with a 43-year history of suicide attempts, of paranoia, of depression, and he was deemed not to require counseling before he got those lethal drugs. There was one study that showed that 94% of non-psychiatric physicians said that they didn't think that they could determine whether a psychiatric disorder was impairing a person's judgment when they were requesting assisted suicide. And so aside from these obvious flaws, there are just endless loopholes. And pretty much all of the state laws that we've seen legalizing assisted suicide, every single one we've seen loophole after loophole after loophole, and too often those seeking to end their lives by assisted suicide, they're able to use these loopholes. The doctors are able to use loopholes, facilities and the other individuals who are perhaps close to a patient. There can be doctor shopping where if one doctor says no or suggests, well, try a treatment instead, it's likely to work. A person who's vulnerable, a person who may be suffering from depression, is able to simply go to another doctor, maybe one who's on that list, who's signed up and said, yes, I will prescribe assisted suicide drugs, and get those drugs. Sadly, then even if the doctor does refer for counseling, the purpose of the evaluations is to determine competence. It's not to treat the underlying issue. It's not to treat the potential depression or whatever it might be. Then once competence is established, the patient has the ability to request the life-ending drugs, which aren't tracked after delivery. They can be appropriated by others. They can be misused. There are no witnesses required, so we don't know if the act was truly voluntary or even self-administered. And in fact, in the bills proposed thus far, there's no requirement that only the person who actually receives the prescription can administer the dose. Instead, self-administer is defined as the patient's act of ingesting. In Washington, for example, the Assisted Suicide Act states, and this is a quote, "Self-administer means a qualified patient's act of ingesting medication to end his or her life." And so there's this grim irony in the prospect of mainstreaming assisted suicide in the name of individual autonomy and liberty, when this legalization simultaneously introduces new ways to compromise that autonomy, to compromise that liberty, and potentially coerce and oppress vulnerable individuals, for example, through elder exploitation and the abuse of individuals living with disabilities. Meanwhile, American physicians tend to be rightly concerned about assisted suicide as a threat to the integrity of their profession and to their conscience. The assisted suicide laws that we've seen in the United States, they contain at best only the most limited conscience protections to avoid coercive or mandatory participation in these deaths by doctors. And these are the same healing professionals who have sworn to first do no harm. In fact, most modern versions, contemporary versions of the Hippocratic Oath, not sworn often enough anymore, but still sort of the bellwether of medicine, they require physicians to swear that they will give no deadly drug to anybody who asked for it, nor make a suggestion to this effect. But assisted suicide negates a core tenet of the curative, the healing, and the caring professional role of the physician. The U.S. Supreme Court has stated that the government undoubtedly has an interest in protecting the integrity and ethics of the medical profession. And so, Justice Scalia wrote, "Virtually every relevant source of authoritative meaning confirms that the phrase legitimate medical purpose does not include intentionally assisting in suicide. Medicine," he wrote, "refers to the science and art dealing with the prevention, cure, or alleviation of disease." The AMA, he continued, has determined that physician-assisted suicide is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as healer. As Dr. Joseph Marine wrote for the Baltimore Sun, if we allow this form of euthanasia into our healthcare system, it will inevitably corrode and destroy the values that define the health professions and lead to public trust in them. No one will be immune to its long-term corrosive and destructive effects on the healthcare system. And then, as Canadian hematologist Dr. Sheila Harding put it, assisted suicide eviscerates what medicine is intended to be and is contrary to the very core of medicine. A Canadian news article reported that another Canadian physician, Dr. Jennifer Tong, warned, coercing physicians against their conscience would damage patient-doctor relations and push some out of the profession, simply because they still believe that a physician's role is to heal, is to care, is to cure, but always to care. But we've seen some American medical associations, sadly, traditionally opposed to assisted suicide, but considering taking neutral positions. Not only that, but in some cases even considering forcing doctors to participate in assisted suicide, to refer for assisted suicide. Now, the good news is that the American Medical Association on June 10th, so just a few weeks ago, they adopted a report studying assisted suicide by a vote of 360 to 190 votes. Delegates also voted 392 to 162 to reaffirm current AMA, American Medical Association, policy on assisted suicide, and this is actually a strengthening of opposition to assisted suicide. It's very encouraging from the American Medical Association. The report's bottom line, in fact, was leave in place the AMA's current policy, which takes the more harm than good position. Opponents of assisted suicide favored adopting the report, that's us, and so the result leaves in place the Code of Medical Ethics Opinion 5.7, and that states that permitting physicians to engage in assisted suicide would ultimately cause more harm than good. Physician-assisted suicide, it says, is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as healer. That same thing the Justice Scalia quoted in a U.S. Supreme Court opinion. The AMA continues that it would be difficult or impossible to control and would pose serious societal risks. Instead of engaging in assisted suicide, the AMA says, physicians must aggressively respond to the needs of patients at the end of life. That care approach, care and healing, instead of just turning to death. Now, there is bad news. The bad news is that on June 22nd, the American Nurses Association, at its membership meeting in Washington, D.C., just down the street from our offices, they dropped their opposition to assisted suicide. The ANA's prior position in 2013 prohibited nurses' participation in assisted suicide. It was very, very good, very strong. The ANA's new position, in contrast, includes the following recommendations. Nurses, it says, must be comfortable supporting patients with end-of-life conversations, assessing the context of a medical aid in dying request. So they changed their terminology from assisted suicide to medical aid in dying. knowing about aid in dying laws and how those affect practice, remain objective when discussing end-of-life options with patients who are exploring medical aid in dying, and have an ethical duty to be knowledgeable about this evolving issue. So we've seen this, this dramatic swing in just the last 6 years from the American Nurses Association. And it's concerning. It's very troubling. It's troubling for doctors. It's troubling for nurses. We've seen that it's troubling for pharmacists. It's troubling for coroners. And we've talked about a lot of the problems with the American Assisted Suicide bills and American Assisted Suicide laws. While many proponents of assisted suicide claim that there are adequate safeguards in these bills and laws to protect individuals, to protect vulnerable populations, as Paul Russell, the founder of HOPE, Preventing Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide, wrote, he wrote, "I have never come across a safeguard that could guarantee safety for vulnerable people. After all, unless we describe in the law every possible illness and every possible remedy, what possibility is there that we can ensure safety? And the variables are infinite," he writes. "What the supposed safeguards do well is to protect doctors. They are provided with an immunity from prosecution for homicide or assisting in suicide if they comply with the set of procedures." In simpler, more direct, and unfortunately cruder terms, assisted suicide endorses the right of doctors, creates a right for doctors to give some Americans, some individuals, the means to fatally overdose. And in fact, we've seen that in practice. At one hearing that I recently attended and testified at, there were 2 bills being heard that day. One was about opioid abuse, opioid overdoses, how to prevent them, what the state could do to combat this this real scourge, this crisis in the United States. It's impacted me personally and my family. You know, all the different methods, all the different ideas that are out there to try to fight back and to prevent fatal overdoses. The other bill was on assisted suicide. So we had one bill about preventing overdoses and one bill about potentially encouraging overdoses. The irony seemed to be lost on many of the lawmakers, but I found it quite troubling. Nonetheless, we do have reason to hope, not only in our state houses, but also in our courts, all the state courts that we've won, all the way up to the Supreme Court. We now have Justice Gorsuch on the bench, and he wrote a pivotal book on assisted suicide called The Future of Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia, published in 2006, the year that he joined the 10th Circuit. In this book, Justice Gorsuch reveals that he firmly opposes assisted suicide and euthanasia. First, he lays out a short history of suicide, and then he argues that all human beings are intrinsically valuable, and the intentional taking of human life by private persons is always wrong. He says that an act that summons death, whether by administering lethal drugs or pulling the plug on a life support machine, is murky, but the intention matters. He says once we open the door to excusing or justifying the intentional taking of life as necessary, he writes, we introduce the real possibility that the lives of some persons, very possibly the weakest and most vulnerable among us, may be deemed less valuable and receive less protection from the law than others. We may not see the research, all of the necessary developments that we need to help vulnerable communities. And we heard that earlier this afternoon even, that not everyone gets the supports they need. And instead, so often, we see vulnerable individuals being ushered instead towards death. Justice Gorsuch also recognizes the potential for abuse accompanying the so-called right to end one's life, and that includes mistake, abuse, or pressure. Now, the reason why individuals may choose to try to seek assisted suicide, we know that in the majority of cases, the vast majority of cases, it has nothing to do with pain, and it has nothing to do with fear of pain. Ezekiel Emanuel, a prominent bioethicist, has written that patients themselves say that the primary motive is not to escape physical pain, but psychological distress. The main drivers, he writes, are depression, hopelessness, and fear of loss of autonomy and control. He writes, in this light, assisted suicide looks less like a good death in the face of unremitting pain and more like plain old suicide. And the top reasons cited for assisted suicide in Oregon are fear of losing autonomy, 91.5% of individuals cited that, of being less able to engage in activities, 88.7%, and the loss of dignity, 79.3%. One study in that state specifically cites depression as an overlooked factor in requests for assisted suicide. But even if assisted suicide were about reducing people's pain, Justice Gorsuch says that isn't enough reason to legalize assisted suicide, because in practice, few governments require doctors to provide any kind of proof or evidence of intolerable pain before facilitating life-ending procedures, he argues. So that's something that would be good to know. It would be good to research, and the research, the data simply does not indicate that is a major factor. And so instead, Justice Gorsuch writes, the impulse for assistance in suicide, like the impulse for, as he calls it, old-fashioned suicide, might more often than not be the result of an often readily treatable condition, such as depression. Another of the more recent justices added to the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Kavanaugh, likewise seems to have some indications that he would rule favorably on this issue for us. Justice Kavanaugh has publicly stated his admiration for former Chief Justice Rehnquist's generally, but especially his Glucksberg analysis, which we discussed a little bit earlier. But he especially appreciates, Justice Kavanaugh appreciates that the Chief Justice Rehnquist conducted appropriate substantive due process analysis in that decision by asking whether a so-called right to assisted suicide with the aid of a doctor was long-standing and well-established in common law and tradition. That's a critical analysis for these kinds of cases. And Chief Justice Rehnquist went through that analysis in the Glucksberg case and found that, in fact, it was not well established in common law and tradition, and in fact, there was no right to assisted suicide. There is no right to assisted suicide in the U.S. Constitution. And so our hope lies in our victories in the state houses, in Congress, in the courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court. As so many states have continued to reject proposed assisted suicide legislation, as courts are rejecting attempts to claim assisted suicide as a right, and as organizations nationwide, worldwide even, vigorously oppose the mainstreaming of intentional death and affirm historic and life-affirming practices in both medicine and in law. Our hope lies in the 0% of DC residents who signed up for assisted suicide. And our hope lies in the knowledge that we are pushing back, that we're making progress, and that there are real, holistic, life-affirming solutions that we can all live with. Thank you.
So I'm going to thank everyone who's watching, but also people who are going to be watching in the future. The video production would have been better if it weren't for what happened with our internet. So what's going to happen is it's going to be uploaded, and those who are watching it, somewhere down the line, we're going to be hearing me saying this thing. That's interesting. It's going to be uploaded to YouTube, and it's going to be made available. And what we're going to do to make it easier to watch it is we're going to make it available in sections, because there's several talks. Break it into the talks so it's easier to watch it as 20-minute pieces. But I thank you for joining us today. The whole point of today was to try and bring information to people, and whether this is being watched today, which is on my anniversary of working with EPC, or this is being watched a month from now or 2 months, whatever, this is an opportunity to provide good information for people who are watching. Thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you to all our speakers. So you heard me, Chris. I'm going to be wanting these broken into sections, and the reason is very simple. How many people? First of all, who wants to sit through a 2-hour session? Well, very few. Secondly, each talk has its own sort of theme. I don't know if Amy and